they engineer themselves to fit their environment at the same time that they're engineering their environment to make it easier to live in, and that was just something that they always assumed you would do both, whereas humans usually have this idea that we are going to focus much more on engineering our environment.
We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us. But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges, while the foolish build barriers.
You raise walls, I destroy them. Let's see who prevails.
Just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Allow my sword to join you in the fight against evil.
The world needs us to chase dreams.
We have to dedicate ourselves each and every single day to this fight, because I can't do it alone.
You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Crocodiles on Tidally Locked Planets with Charlie Jane Anders.
I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Paul.
And today we're here with Charlie Jane Anders. Welcome to the show, Charlie Jane.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Charlie Jane is the author of a new science fiction novel called The City in the Middle of the Night. So can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so my elevator pitch for The City in the Middle of the Night is a girl gets banished into eternal darkness, but she survives by learning to communicate with the creatures that live there in the dark. And that kind of sums up the book a little bit, actually. That's kind of the setup for it, but it also that's the main kind of point of the book, I guess.
But then lots of shenanigans happen. I mean,
yes.
I'd seen that pitch way back. It's like, okay, she's going to go into darkness and then she's going to come back. And she comes back rather quickly, and then lots of other things happen.
Yeah.
Spool out from that trip into the night.
Yeah, no, it's true. There's lots and lots of shenanigans, like you said. It's kind of a complicated world, and she's changed by her experience going into the night, and what she learns ends up changing things for a lot of people. But there's also, a lot of other sort of politics going on and other characters who have their own journeys in the book. So it's kind of more complicated than that. But it's basically this kind of tidally locked planet, like you said, where there's a permanent day side and a permanent night side, and one side always faces the sun. And humans are actually living on the Terminator, which is the sort of strip of twilight in between the day side and the night side. And it turns out that the creatures living in the night that we thought were just food or predators or whatever are actually intelligent. They have their own culture. They have their own society. And they're human equivalent, or possibly even slightly more advanced in some ways. And, meanwhile, humans are kind of reaching a point where they're trying to figure out how they can survive on this planet long term, because the things that we've been doing as human beings to adapt to a planet that's radically different from Earth have kind of stopped cutting it quite so much. And these two different human societies that we encounter are both kind of struggling in their own way. And, there are certain people in the book, like Sophie's best friend, Bianca, who really think it's time for humans to try something different and to kind of try a different strategy for surviving on this other planet.
Indeed, you do. We got plenty to dig into it. So the name of this planet is January, and so what inspired you to set a novel on a tidally locked planet?
Yeah, so the name of the planet, January, I guess it has two meanings. First of all, Janus is the two-faced god in Greek and Roman mythology, I guess Roman mythology specifically. So the idea of a planet that has two faces, a day side and a night side, it kind of has something in common with Janus. But also, it's called January because it's a fresh start. It's a brand new start. It's for the human species. It's like we're starting over, brand new page. And the thing about the tidally locked planet is, I was working at IO9, which was this this website that Annalee Newitz founded that I helped to kind of start up, and we were doing a lot of science coverage alongside our science fiction coverage. And it was sort of the golden age of us learning about exoplanets in a lot of ways. And one thing that we kept finding was that a lot of the exoplanets that we discovered that were in the habitable zone of their own stars were tidally locked. And what I was hearing from scientists was any planet that humans find that's like likely to be in the habitable zone of their star, especially since a lot of those stars are red dwarfs, a lot of those planets are going to be tidally locked. And there's a high likelihood that humans would end up colonizing a tidally locked planet if we did manage to colonize a planet outside our solar system. And just, the thing of trying to imagine what that would be like being on a planet that is, permanently facing the star on one side, and having like those two extreme environments side by side on one planet, and the idea that day and night are places rather than times. It was something that I just got really obsessed with. And I spent, a few years just kind of sketching out this world and trying to imagine what it would be like. And it was something that kind of just, the world kind of grew out of that idea. And I had this, from early on, I had this notion of, well, complicated human politics and all the sort of Game of Thronesy stuff of like, humans plotting to gain power among each other and so on, but also these creatures living in the darkness. And I always love the idea of trying to understand a life form that not only is really different from us, but lives in an environment that we can't really go into and that they can't really come into our environment. And so it's like, there's a huge barrier to understanding each other. And I thought that was something super fascinating to kind of dig into.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd seen intimations of a couple tidal locked planets before. There's a Larry Niven story that before the science is right, has Mercury as a tidally locked planet. It's not tidally locked.
Right.
And then there's Roger Zelazny's Jack of Shadows, which has Earth as a tidally locked planet with one permanent day side, one permanent night side. But he wasn't thinking about the physics and the climatology that results from having a tidally locked planet. And you depict that really well. The boiling season on one end and the glaciers on the far side. And having this really narrow band in between that the humans can kind of live in, unless they start screwing around with their ecology as they do.
Right, the way humans always do. And, I think that what I learned towards the end of, like, when I was just finishing up revising the novel, I talked to some climate experts who said that maybe the kind of the differential that I had there between the boiling hot day side and the kind of glacier-y night side, that might be a little more extreme than you would actually see on a real tidally locked planet. And actually, some scientists now think that you could live on the day side, which I don't have people doing. But part of the reason why you can't live on the day side in my planet is because the UV radiation is too intense. There's no ozone layer, and so you get horrible burns if you go into the day side. But I did talk to a bunch of like geophysicists and other science experts about tidally locked planets, and I tried my best to get it right, and also just to imagine something that's so different and so kind of startling and stark and just challenging, kind of.
And very image drawn the sea, and it's just like the extremes and just showing just how precarious life is on this planet. It's really vividly drawn, the landscape. Even if they might be a little beyond what you'd ever find in quote unquote reality, it's a vividly imagined world.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So time is extremely important in the Zeus fan, and they have a concept called timefulness. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea?
Yeah, so that was part of what I had a lot of fun when during the, like, I guess it was about 2.5 years-ish when I was like just sketching out the world and trying to figure out what the story was and not really quite getting there, but sketching out the world a lot. And I was sort of thought about, what it would be like to live on a planet where there's no sunrise and no sunset, and the sky basically never changes. The sky always looks exactly the same. The shadows never move around. Everything is kind of weirdly static, and like these things that we kind of take for granted that cue us in to, whether it's afternoon or morning or day or night or whatever, they don't have that. And the whole question of like, how do people know when to sleep and when to wake up and when to go to work? And more kind of globally, how do people kind of reckon the passage of time when they don't have this kind of, this natural mechanism around them that they can just refer to? I sort of thought about the fact that they had been on a starship coming to this planet probably for like 100 years. They'd been in flight. But the ship had probably ship's day and ship's night, and there was probably an artificial day-night cycle on the ship. And so, my thought was that when you get there are going to be people who are like, we have to maintain some kind of artificial sleep schedule and work schedule and kind of like lights out schedule and curfew and everything. Or we'll stop being human, and kind of circadian rhythms and that kind of natural awareness of light and dark and the kind of passage of time is part of what makes us human. And that over time that becomes more and more draconian to the point where the society that kind of embraces that artificial schedule and all the curfews and everything becomes really draconian and conformist in general, because it's trying to regulate every aspect of people's lives to make sure that people are kind of, everything's running like a well-oiled machine. And, they have all these systems that are really intricate that are supposed to make sure everybody has enough to eat and everybody has a place to live and so on and so forth. And it kind of becomes a little bit, control freaky. And, over time, as I worked on the book, the question of the passage of time and how people deal with the passage of time became kind of more of a thematic concern. And, the question of how people think about the past and what people consider like the recent past versus the distant past, and how people remember stuff that happened to them or how people deal with stuff that happened to their ancestors became kind of a major theme in the book in general, I think. But it all kind of grew out of like that question of how you deal with not having a sunrise or a sunset.
So do you feel like it is something that has come out particularly of living in a tidally locked planet, or do you feel like there are some influences from current society?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I was really trying to depict, to the best of my ability, what people would do in this really extreme environment. And like, I didn't think of it as particularly having a direct, connection to current US politics or current global politics. I sort of thought, most of the time when I was working on this book, I sort of thought Hillary Clinton was going to be our next president. I thought a lot of things were going to be different by the time this book was published. And I sort of, I wanted this book to be political in the sense of like asking questions about how society is organized and how to, distribute resources and labor fairly, and how we deal with the weight of history, but not so much political in the sense of, you read it and you it makes you want to vote for one candidate or vote against a different candidate or whatever. Because I feel like that kind of political writing sometimes doesn't age as well, and sometimes doesn't, sometimes kind of overshoots its mark. And I'm sort of interested in, part of what I love about writing science fiction, especially science fiction set on another planet or set in, the distant future or a different realm or whatever, is that you get to ask super political questions. Like Game of Thrones is incredibly political about, basic questions of justice and freedom and legitimacy of rulers and so on. But you are kind of far enough removed from present day reality that you can ask those questions without necessarily having to make a direct statement about current affairs or whatever. So that was kind of how I thought of it, I guess.
Yeah, you didn't have to have a Trumpy, but you just had to raise issues and concerns that are more universal without actually having to stick a current political character into the mix or someone who's obviously a clone of the same. You could engage with the politics in a more timeless fashion.
Yeah, that was definitely the goal.
Okay, I want to jump off on that a little bit, and have you talk a little bit about the two societies you've set up, because you set up two very different cities in the book. One that is very, as Elizabeth was talking about, very concerned about time control and having regulation. We see the shutters rise and shutters fall, and there's curfews, and it's very much an authoritarian top-down sort of regime. And then when our characters finally get across the world, they find a very different society that's very much more chaotic, almost. I don't know if you intended it. It felt more like it was a city run by the mob more than anything else. I mean, these noble / gangster families basically running everything, and everything's a lot more chaotic. I wondered if you have talk about how you set up these cultures as very much in opposition to each other, and how they both have strengths, but also both have very different weaknesses that kind of refract on each other in interesting ways.
Yeah, so I mean, I had this city, the city of clocks or whatever you want to call it, Siasfant, where everything is kind of super regimented and super conformist, and everybody kind of follows a really strict schedule and so on and so forth. And, I came up with this idea that there was this other city where basically people had rebelled against that and gone off and started their own, city where basically they were like, we're going to live in harmony with nature. We're going to kind of live in a state of nature. We're going to reject all of this like artificial, conformist timekeeping that is designed to try to make us live as though we were back on Earth. We're going to live in harmony with this planet, the planet that we're living on. And I had, I think that they all ended up getting cut out of the book, but I had some scenes where various people give speeches or kind of talk about this idea that, we're living on a different planet. Everything is different. We should be new people. We should be trying to, like I said, live in harmony with our environment that we're in now, which means that, there's no sunrise, no sunset. So we should just work and sleep whenever we feel like it. But also, it's our duty to just do whatever makes us happy and gives us pleasure. And there was sort of a, almost a kind of hedonistic, nihilistic philosophy that, in some drafts of the book, people were expounding. But I sort of thought a lot about like, what would that actually turn out like if you had a society that was kind of committed to not having as much structure and just kind of letting people sleep whenever they wanted to. And to some extent, this was I talked a lot to my editor about this, particularly Patrick Nelson Hayden at Tor, about, this whole idea of a society where they just do whatever they feel like it. And they don't try to kind of control their day-night cycle or whatever. And, he brought up this thing of basically, it's only been about, 100-something years that we've had electric light. And in some ways that we as a society here on Earth haven't entirely learned how to deal with electric light and haven't learned how to kind of have a healthy relationship to it. People tend to stay up way too late. I mean, people don't sleep as much as they used to. I think that there's been statistics about the fact that, in general, people are getting less sleep now than they were, a few generations ago. And it's like we're drunk on electric light. We're kind of just, I don't know. It almost like is like a drug. It's like something that we just don't know how to ration or whatever. And so we just stay up till 3 a.m, watching Netflix or whatever, or gaming or doing whatever. And then we have to get up the next morning and go to work and we feel like zombies. And, I think that that's something that was kind of in the back of my mind. And so when I thought about what that society would be like, I kind of had this idea that they tried at various times to have an anarchist co-op or to have, various other kinds of structures that were informal. But over time, it's been like 500 years on this planet. Over time, it fell apart. And what they ended up with is basically just, there's no government, there's no authority, there's no power, except that there are these families who, if you're aligned with one of the families, you're under their protection and you get social services from them. You get education, you get healthcare, you get everything from the family you're affiliated with. And I sort of thought that was an interesting contrast to CS Fund. It was sort of like, and I feel like there are societies like that on Earth where a lot of things are based on kind of informal arrangements and not so much on, formal setups. It's more, like you get access to services through, one group or another that you're affiliated with. Much like how in the United States we get our healthcare through our employers, I guess.
Yeah. I was thinking of ancient Rome and the patron system of big gens being the patrons of lesser people who would come to get money and get help from them. And that's reflected in, again, with the opening scene of The Godfather. It's like, one day in this day may never come, I will ask you to do a service for me because I'm helping you now, sort of tit for tat, sort of.
Yeah, totally.
I was just thinking actually that those kind of two very different philosophies come through a bit in the fashions of the cities that you have. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so this was just something that, I kind of came up with over the course of like noodling on the different, drafts that I was working on. But, in CS Font, I sort of thought that, they have different textiles. They have access to different textiles in the different cities. Like, CS Font, they have a lot of leather because they have cattle that they're keeping over to the north side of the city, but also they have certain textiles that they're able to grow through their farm wheels, and they have other stuff that they're able to create. And they don't have a lot of muslin. They don't have a lot of like finer textiles. They don't have kind of silks or things like that. But they do have fancy outfits, and like people like Bianca, who are in the kind of ruling class, have some very fancy outfits that they wear. And it got a little bit like, I didn't want this book to be too silly. I was trying to avoid giving into my silly side, but there was some stuff that was a little bit odd. Like in CS Font, the women tend to wear these ankle skirts that basically what I pictured is you're wearing like capri pants or like regular pants and then you have these skirts that are just sort of like almost like a ruff, like what you have going around the bottom of a table that you pin to the bottom of your pants, and they're sort of loose enough that you can just walk along and they kind of swish around you as you walk. But it's kind of a pain in the neck, and especially when Sophie's trying to climb a mountain wearing these things, it doesn't turn out super well for the ankle skirts. And I sort of thought that was a piece of clothing that you wouldn't find on Earth, let's just say. And I generally pictured people wearing kind of, clothes that I think I talked about how people's outfits kind of really correspond to their jobs. And there are kind of more formal outfits for people who are, in the middle class or professional. And I can't remember, I described those in some detail. And then there's like more kind of boiler suits or overalls or coveralls or whatever for people who are working in the pipes, which there's a lot of stuff about pipe workers because there's an underground river that CS Font is tapping. Plus they do a lot of stuff with waste management. And then in Arguello, it's much more, because one of the things that I came up with is that people in Arguello are much more aware of where their ancestors came from on Earth, and much more aware of their kind of ancestry coming from Earth. There are fashions that you see on Arguello, including some stuff that's kind of like almost like raver clothes. But there's also people wearing stuff that directly comes from what their forebears might have worn back on Earth. And so you have, and it's not 21st century Earth clothes, but you have like, for example, cool suits, which I kind of imagined, which are from Nagpur, where Sophie's ancestors come from, where I sort of imagined it being a thing that's literally designed to keep you cool in extreme hot weather after like heavy duty climate change. And it's sort of it's a two-piece thing that has a lot of ventilation going through the sleeves and through the pant legs and kind of billows out a little bit. And there's probably a little bit of technology embedded in it to help keep you cool. But also saris and other things like that. And I talked a lot to a friend of mine from India about what, 24th, 25th century Indian fashions might be like. And that was really fun to think about. And I tried to do that for some of the other sort of groups that had also come from Earth, from these different city-states in the 24th, 25th century. And that was sort of a fun exercise. I definitely wanted the fashions to be very different in the two different cities.
Yeah, that's something I didn't pick up on. I'm glad Elizabeth did. Not that I have a really good sense of fashion, but now that Elizabeth posed the question, you point out, yeah, I can see like how your world building through showing by what people are wearing or not wearing and what that all implies. So I did want to have you talk a little bit about the background on Earth, because we are set on this planet of January, and then when we get to Arguello, we get to find out a lot more about the background on Earth, and it seems to be like almost like a surviving city-state sort of model. So I know you only sketch in bits, and it's really just background to what's happening now. But I was wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you developed the future Earth that the colonists that go to January came from, and what that world building process was like.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I created like a really like kind of a big document of like the future history that, most of it isn't in the book as it came out, but I wanted all of that to be kind of sketched out as clearly in my own head as I possibly could, because, it drives me nuts when there's a story about future humans like 1,000, 1,200, whatever years in the future, and we either have exactly the same ethnic groups that we have now, or ethnicity has just been kind of hand waved away. Like everybody's mixed race, or we describe people's skin color, but we don't really describe, their ethnic identity or their kind of cultural identity, because to me, those things all come from history. And especially once I started thinking of this book as having a major theme of how we deal with the past and how we deal with the passage of time and how we kind of think about things that have happened and like how we reckon with, our pasts, our collective and our personal past. It seemed really important to have something that was not kind of half-assed in there, that was like the history of what happened in the future Earth. And so, basically what I came up with was, unfortunately, the intervening centuries were not good times, I don't think. Like, by like the 23rd, 24th century, most of the Earth's surface is pretty uninhabitable due to climate change, but also due to some wars and some accidents and some, possibly biological and chemical weapons that were used. And, you name it, a lot of bad stuff happened, I think, in the 22nd, 23rd century. And so you have this thing in the 24th century-ish where basically the human species is, as far as we know, there are 7 city-states, and I kind of left it open that there might be more, but there are 7 city-states that we know of where humans are living. And I tried to pick places that aren't like the most famous cities on Earth now. Things like Ulaanbaatar in what's now Mongolia, and Merida in what's now Mexico, and Calgary in what's now Canada, and so on and so forth. And, large swathes of the world are probably just gone, like Western Europe, gone. Like Europe is basically Zagreb at this point. Zagreb in what's now Croatia is what remains of Europe. And similarly, what remains of North America is Calgary and Merida. And I sort of had this idea that, when the end was coming, and it was clear that only these 7 city-states were going to survive, anybody who could get out of the United States fled and ran to Calgary. And part of why Calgary had a lot of trouble was because it was kind of overrun by refugees from the United States who had to be integrated into Calgary society. And things didn't necessarily go that great for them because there wasn't enough space for all these refugees. And, it was a bunch of pushy USA, people trying to kind of integrate into this Canadian city. And so I had a lot of that stuff in the back of my mind of like how things went down. And, then there was this idea that each of these 7 city-states kind of pooled their resources to build this mothership and, basically put everything they had together. And so Merida was like the aerospace capital of the world in like the 25th century. And they had developed, they were building rockets and stuff. So they were able to build the engines for the mothership. And, Khartoum in what's now Sudan basically was like the cyberpunk capital of the world. And they had the most advanced computing, and they were developing artificial intelligences and so on. So they built the shipboard computers on the mothership and so on and so forth. So everybody kind of brought something different to the mothership. And then once they left Earth and they were in flight, every single city-state had its own compartment where its people could live. And the idea was, we'll all get there and everybody will kind of have their own stuff to offer, and each culture will be kind of represented on the new planet. But of course, a bunch of really bad stuff went down during the long, long, long voyage from Earth. And by the time they arrive, things have gotten pretty messed up because they would, during such a long voyage, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit as I was reading this and piecing together what had happened on the voyage. I was thinking a little bit of Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora and how that's a colony ship that goes really wrong.
Yeah, and that came out while I was working on this. There's been a bunch of books in that genre. There was that book Journey into the Unknown, which came out like maybe 7 or 8 years ago. That was like basically a generation ship where everything goes super pear-shaped. But it's like, in science fiction, usually when you have a generation ship, and there's also Across the Universe, I guess, which was a YA set on a generation ship where some bad stuff has gone down, which I can't remember the name of the author, but it'll come back to me in a second. But I feel like, generation ships, one thing that's constant in science fiction is generation ships tend to have some really bad stuff go down.
I mean, you also don't need to look to space for that. If you look at, like, the ships travelling from Europe to Australia, for example, but bad stuff goes down.
Long months on the ocean with no sight of land, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's an enclosed environment. It's sort of like prison almost. And, you would hope that, I mean, what, Charlie Strauss always says that to make a generation ship work, you'd have to basically make it like Belgium in space or whatever. You'd have to make it huge and self-sustaining and really nice, like to the extent that Belgium is nice, like basically like with, farms and food and like culture and stuff to do. And like, Charlie Strauss basically says, in order for a generation ship to work at all, it has to be so nice that when people arrived at the planet that they were supposed to settle, they might not want to leave the ship. They might be like, screw it, we're staying up here. Like, why don't we just take some resources from this planet and keep going because it's so much nicer on this ship. We don't have to terraform some dumb planet. So, I think that that's probably the way it would have to work, is if you had something that was just basically like, a resort or something.
Wall-E, except it's people are not all too apathetic to do anything.
Yeah, Wall-E without the fat shaming.
Yes, exactly.
It's, something that's just like a nice environment where people are comfortable and where there's something to kind of occupy us day to day, because obviously that's a separate issue.
As long as there are books, I'm golden.
Yeah, same.
So the crocodiles, as they are, I found it interesting how you frame the book. You have it at the beginning, basically like this is a translation, and some of these names aren't actually accurate.
Right.
I appreciate that little bit of historiography right in the formatter of the novel. Felt like it was like a document of some kind from that we were looking at past events. So anyway, so the crocodiles are the indigenous species on the planet. So I was wanting you to talk about how do you develop a species that lives mostly in the darkness of a tightly locked planet and still comes up with a material culture, a civilization, a society, interesting technology, and a complicated relationship with the humans that they have to basically spoilers, that they have to do things to Sophie to really finally connect with her.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about, like I said, the germ of this novel was the tightly locked planet thing, but then also early on I was like, okay, so there's creatures living in the darkness who, can't come into the light, and their environment is so cold and so inhospitable that we can't really go to them, especially once we've lost all of our scout ships and all of our, all-terrain vehicles and all of our, exploration gear. That's pretty much all gone at this point. And so what is that going to be like? And what are these, what would these creatures, how would they communicate? How would they, especially if you assume that it's pitch dark, but also there's like a really loud wind. It's really just, kind of terrifying in general. They can't necessarily communicate using sound. I wanted something that was really different, something that wasn't just, kind of a little bit different or based on some creature from Earth. And I kind of thought about, I forget how I came up with the idea of their shape and everything, but mostly I wanted something where they have a way of communicating that doesn't rely on sound or any other kind of, method that we might think of. And the idea of like touch telepathy and basically being able to touch each other, and through this kind of goo that they secrete, they're able to kind of share ideas and memories and thoughts and experiences that they've had. And that seemed like such a fun, interesting way to communicate that once I started doing that, I kind of ran with it. And then I eventually had to think about like, okay, so what kind of culture do they have? Like, presumably they've had to like get good at building and good at like, creating certain kinds of technology in order to be able to survive on a planet where there's ice storms all the frickin' time in the planet where they're living. So they're technological, they're advanced in that way. And I came up with this idea that they were basically that they don't recognize a distinction between geoengineering and bioengineering. Like the two things are kind of the same to them, that they engineer themselves to fit their environment at the same time that they're engineering their environment to make it easier to live in. And that was just something that they always assumed you would do both. Whereas humans usually have this idea that we are going to focus much more on engineering our environment. And, kind of there's a taboo on actually screwing around with human beings and trying to make us different as creatures to be able to live in our habitat. So I thought that was a really interesting, fun thing to play around with. But, and the fact that they're able to share past experiences and kind of, share experiences that someone else has shared previously with them felt like something that was really, I don't know, it went along with that whole thing I talked about of like the passage of time and how we deal with the past and everything. It felt like this was kind of an interesting kind of, it dovetailed with that in a way that I really liked. So it all kind of flowed together, I guess.
And you make them so evocative. I mean, we meet Rose at very early on, and then we don't see Rose for most of the novel, and then Rose reappears with the timepiece. I mean, my heart just like squeezed to see that. Like, oh,
I'm so glad. Wow, thank you.
That was a nice wraparound to the beginning. That really made the crocodiles. Okay, humans are the right. They really make them fully integrated as a species and as a culture and as characters for me to do that.
Yay, thank you.
We should also note that the crocodiles don't call themselves crocodiles or refer to themselves in that way.
Yeah.
And Sophie, particularly, who bonds quite closely with them, comes to kind of abhor that term and calls them, is it Gellet?
Yeah, Gellet is how I pronounce it, yeah.
You're right, Elizabeth. There's that whole idea, like, and I don't know if you meant it directly, Charlie, it's the whole idea of like calling people by what they want to be called rather than what you think you should call them, sort of little Philip there.
Yeah.
But also, just jumping in there, it kind of, as an Australian, this is something that comes up for me from time to time, is that the idea of calling a creature after a different creature. So, for example, Australian magpies and European magpies are very different birds, but they're both called magpies.
Are they related?
Not as far as I know.
Huh. Interesting.
So, I was wondering if that was like something that you were intentionally doing with the crocodiles to bring in that kind, because it is a book that focuses a lot on colonialism. And whether that was kind of an element that you were looking to kind of weave in.
Yeah, I mean, originally it started out with this thing of like not wanting to have a lot of vocabulary that was sort of weird and alien in the book, because I sort of assume it's, the 33rd century. Nobody's speaking English. Nobody's speaking, they're speaking Siasfanti and Argilan, which both grew out of this language that they spoke on the mothership called Nu Olang, and or Nu Ulang, I guess is how you pronounce it. And I've never pronounced it out loud before. So the names for things, if I was just going to transcribe the names that they were using for things, there'd be a lot of kind of hard to pronounce stuff and a lot of like just kind of weird diphthongy 10 consonants in a row type things. And I didn't really want to do that. And I thought it was interesting to have this thing of like, well, it's being translated into English from these future languages. And as part of that, we're just going to use the English words for things, even if it's not the exact word. And so it's kind of partly the translator doing that. And partly this is what the people on the planet were also doing. They were also intentionally using English or, Earth terms, not necessarily English terms, but Earth terms for stuff because it's easier. And it's just like, well, we'll just call it a cat, even though it doesn't look like anything like a cat from Earth. It's, it's got spikes and it vomits acid and stuff, but it's a cat. And so I sort of thought that it would be easier, but also it did then kind of set up this thing where there's this extra barrier where that you're kind of getting things filtered through this translation that's not really exact. And that, when you just keep being reminded that things aren't necessarily what they seem to be. And that when you hear about a cat, it actually is this creature with like spikes on its neck that vomits acid and, all this other stuff. And that can apparently be milked to make cat butter. So that's exciting. But, I wanted that to be a little bit jarring, I guess. And then over time, there were several drafts where they never stopped being called crocodiles. They were just always called crocodiles. And then I sort of thought, that is kind of disrespectful. And it was towards the end of the revision process where I sort of thought, having them be called crocodiles, like at some point, Sophie has to realize that that's a little bit disrespectful, and that she, and that's not what they are, and that, she needs to find a different name for them, that they're not animals, that they're not, except to the sense that humans are animals, but they're not, they're sapient, they're human equivalent, and they deserve a name that's not, as reductive. And that was something that, I really didn't think of until pretty late in the process. And when I thought of it, I was like, oh yeah, God. Cause like the moment I thought about it, it made total sense that you would not want to, just do that. And so it just kind of happened.
A very nice organic add-in late in the process. I think Liz and I both really appreciate you taking that lens and looking through it and interrogating basically your own work. Like, no, that's not what she should be doing. She should actually come to terms with that and show some respect and it shows a bit of character growth on her part in the bargain.
Yay, thanks.
So, in the book, you touch a little bit on disability for the Gallet, and given the issues of disability is so rarely mentioned in SFF, what led you to explore it through a species that's part of like a hive mind or has some kind of collective consciousness?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a spoiler, but towards the end of the book, we meet one of the Gallet, one of these creatures who has been injured in an accident and has some trauma from that. And I was trying to just sort of think about because it would be very easy in this book to just portray this, society with touch telepathy and all of this, all this stuff that I wish I had. Like, I wish that I could just touch someone and make them understand what I'm thinking and feeling and share what I've experienced and understand what they've experienced. I mean, that's like a dream in a lot of ways. And I didn't want it to just be like, oh, this is a perfect utopian society that nothing bad ever happens and everything's perfect. I wanted to think about how do they deal with, obviously trauma is an issue in the book in general. And it does kind of come back to that question of the passage of time and how you think about the past. Trauma is obviously a big thing where the past is something that you can't necessarily let go of as easily as people might expect you to or want you to. And so I was like, how do they deal with trauma? How do they deal with that? And how might, this kind of telepathy where you can share things really easily, how might that actually backfire? And so that was the thing that I was thinking about in terms of, how they try to be really respectful and nice to this person who suffered this injury, but their concern is actually stifling and it's actually too much and it kind of hurts. Being kind of bombarded with other people's concern and other people's attempts to cheer you up and other people's kind of solicitude and whatever is kind of exhausting. And that's something that I think people experience in real life. In real life, if you've been through something and people are just constantly trying to kind of cheer you up or make you feel better, it's going to possibly make you feel worse in a lot of ways. And so I was just trying to imagine how much more intense that could be with that kind of telepathy. And then you get other hints here and there, like the way that they behave towards Sophie at various times. You get other hints that there is a dark side and that there's a downside to the way that their society functions and to this kind of, ability to share everything. It kind of, obviously you can overshare and you can also hurt people. And, it's easy to hurt people intentionally or unintentionally by kind of exposing them to shared emotions and thoughts and memories. And that was something that I really wanted to get into. And the thing about disability, it just sort of, it felt like, how do you deal as a society with people who have different needs and different abilities? And I didn't want it to be like a kind of idealized utopia. I wanted it to be kind of something where it's it's not perfect. They try, they want to do the right thing, but it's definitely not perfect.
I think you succeeded in that regard, that it does provide as you point out, this is the Gallet are not a utopian society where everything is perfect. And you even layered that throughout the book that there have been rises and falls of Gallet civilization. So yeah, they don't have all the answers either. And I think in the end, you suggested in the novel, the only best way forward is for both humans and Gallet to come together, because you kind of imply throughout the book that the planet's not doing that great because of human meddling and just changes in the environment, that they need to come to terms with their own biases, their own problems, societal and otherwise, in order to actually confront the challenges that are ahead of them.
Yeah, and I never want to write a book where it's like there's easy answers or there's like this is the way forward, or whatever. I want to write a book that's just sort of like, well, here are some questions and here are some thoughts, kind of.
So we could talk to you for another hour, but that might be a little unfair because there's so much to chew about this book. So why don't you tell your listeners where we can find you, what you have coming out next, and what you're doing this spring and going forward for the rest of this year?
Yeah, where you can find me, I'm on Twitter at Charlie Jane, and I guess also Facebook as Charlie Jane. I'm working on a young adult trilogy, which I'm hoping the first book will be out in 2020 sometime. And I'm traveling a lot. I'm going to be at SwanCon in Perth. I'm going to be at Replicon in Sweden, which I'm super excited about. I'm going to be at CanCon in Ottawa. That's going to be really fun. Those are all going to be really fun, I think. And I'm super excited to be doing a lot of conventions.
And I think this episode will be out before you actually be here in Minneapolis for Wordplay.
Yeah, I'm going to be in Minneapolis for Wordplay. That's going to be super fun. That's going to be awesome. Yeah, and also I co-host a podcast, a podcast that's, almost as awesome as the Skiffy and Fanty show called Our Opinions Are Correct, which Annalie Newitz and I do. And so, that's always, if people like podcasts, which maybe your listeners do, that would be a thing to maybe check out.
Indeed so. I am a fan and a patron of the show, and gladly so.
Oh, thank you. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Listeners, if you'd like to drop us a line, you can do so through email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com or on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. To make sure you don't miss anything, sign up for our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And we would also appreciate your support at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty.
So I want to thank you, Charlie Jane, for being on the Skiffy and Fanty show tonight.
It was my pleasure. It was absolutely my pleasure.
And thank you, Elizabeth, for being my partner in crime. And with that, listeners, stay frosty and scene.
If you would like to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or find us on Twitter at skiffyandfanty, our webpage skiffyandfanty.com, or you can even send us an email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The intro music for this podcast was taken from Rock Thing by Creo. You can find out more about their music on freemusicarchive.org.